Thank you all for coming. My name is Peter Mackall, and I'm the Divisional Dean for the Humanities and Social Sciences at Dornsife. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to the first of a series of what we're calling Dornsife Dialogues. And it is our effort to have really smart, civil discussion about the moment that we now find ourselves in.
This dialogue series was inspired by an observation that many of us have, that it seems like people in our nation today have forgotten how to talk to each other in a civil way, who've forgotten how to disagree with each other without turning each other into monsters, and to have a really reasoned debate. And this is what universities are all about. So if anyone ought to be really talking about how to return civility to debate, it ought to be us. It ought to be universities. We should be taking the lead. This is the place where we think about things from different perspectives, where we make sense of ideas in different ways, and where we rip each other's arguments to shreds with civility and finesse. So what better place than here to take a big step back and to look at the issues that are happening today from a different perspective, the perspective of a research university. That your professors have trained to separate that emotional connection from the analysis of facts and information. And the goal is to get to the truth, where there is an underlying truth, or to form a reasoned opinion where there are multiple interpretations that might be possible. Can they fail and get caught up in the emotional argument? Yes, of course. Just like a trained surgeon can slip and cut you with a knife. But still, if you want to learn how to think in this particular way, these folks are your best tool, just like you'd want to go to a surgeon to learn how to take out an appendix. So the goal of the Dornsife Dialogues is to bring to you some of these top scholars, who also happen to, many of them, and we hope everyone in this series, be a lot of fun to talk to open up some conversations about some of the big issues of today. And do it in ways that adhere to the rules of academic discourse. Begin with the assumption that different ideas come from different worldviews or different starting points, not from a place of malice. Listen carefully to each other's argument, analyze the different components of the argument, separate the facts from assertions, and be honest about what the facts are. Remember, everyone's entitled to your perspective, but you're not entitled to make up facts. And then debate these ideas in a civilized way. And this requires two more pieces that I'd like to call your attention to. The first one is being informed. And the second one, that's almost even more important, is not being afraid to admit the limits of your knowledge.
I am not going to present a Pollyanna picture of the way America ever was, but it was different. Politics was always rough and tumble. We heard about Jefferson and Adams, and the 1800 campaign was absolutely brutal in terms of what was said about each other and what their partisans said about each other. And Adams was so angry that he didn't show up to the inauguration of Jefferson. He was in a carriage already on his way back to Massachusetts. And Jefferson, in his inaugural address, said, "Not every difference of opinion is a difference of principle. We have too often called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." Now, that set a kind of standard about public discourse, certainly at the highest level, that despite the fact that campaigns could get rough and tough and people could attack each other personally, there was a kind of a baseline that you had to live with. And if we go back only 57 years, to the first Kennedy-Nixon debate. I want to show you not Kennedy, but Nixon. Kennedy gave the opening statement in the debate. Nixon had a response, and this was how he responded. And think about the difference between that and some of what you've seen in recent debates. And you can go ahead and play it.
The things that Senator Kennedy has said, many of us can agree with. There is no question but that we cannot discuss our internal affairs in the United States without recognizing that they have a tremendous bearing on our international position. There is no question but that this nation cannot stand still, because we are in a deadly competition, a competition not only with the men in the Kremlin, but the men in Peking. We're ahead in this competition, as Senator Kennedy, I think, has implied. But when you're in a race, the only way to stay ahead is to move ahead. And I subscribe completely to the spirit that Senator Kennedy has expressed tonight, the spirit that the United States should move ahead. Where then do we disagree?
Gives you a sense of the tone and of what was expected and required of people in this dialogue. I mean, it's a fact-based argument that is going to occur on both sides. And I'm not commenting on Richard Nixon or what happened later in Watergate, although I'll avert to that in a minute. But I'm saying that there was an expectation, no matter what you thought of your opponent, that you had to talk in a certain way. It had to be fact-based, it had to be respectful. You had to even say many of the things Senator Kennedy has said we can agree with. And what changed this? It changed shortly afterwards. It began with the Vietnam War and the intense passions that it aroused. And by the way, other people may have a different interpretation of these events than I would. But literally people gathering outside the White House chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Or after Richard Nixon was elected, you had his vice president, Spiro Agnew, go out there and with a series of famous lines, attack the press and its motives, attack protesters and their motives. The press were nattering nabobs of negativism. And as we went into Watergate, the country was not only deeply divided, but there was real anger, and there was not the kind of incivility we see today, but there was a kind of incivility that hadn't occurred in a long time. After Watergate, we got a reversion to a level of civility with each other. If you look at the Ford-Carter debates, if you look at what they said in 1976, whole different thing. And that even held into the 1980s, despite the fears that people had about Ronald Reagan. Conservatives argued that it started to go off the rails with the Bork nomination to the Supreme Court, where Senator Ted Kennedy, for whom I worked, said famously, "Robert Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions, blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters, school children would not be taught about evolution, and the doors of the federal courts would be shut on millions of citizens. No justice would be better than injustice." Kennedy's defenders would have said, look, that wasn't ad hominem. It was a vivid expression of Bork's view. And you could have, I'm not going to take sides in terms of who's right about liberal or conservative. I just want to get a sense of the culture that was emerging here. And in any event, all through this period, you could have really big disagreements. For example, on tax policy, on sanctions on South Africa. But you also had a civility that enabled cooperation. Ronald Reagan worked with Tip O'Neill to save Social Security. He worked with Ted Kennedy for immigration reform and what is now derided as amnesty. I think the real rupture was the election of Bill Clinton. He was seen as illegitimate by a lot of his opponents, many of whom had assumed that someone who had protested the Vietnam War, well, at least one thing we know, they're never going to be president of the United States. That's one price they're going to pay. And he faced endless investigations, one of which at least he brought upon himself, and impeachment, and increasingly angry language. I mean, if you go back and look at the 90s, you can see the seeds of what we're living through now. Under George W. Bush, you had things like swift boats, the culture wars, the attacks on people saying they didn't care about the sanctity of marriage. On the other hand, you had not just disagreement with Bush, but angry personal attacks on him. Howard Dean compared George W. Bush to the Ayatollah Khomeini. All of this, by the way, has increasingly been enabled by the internet and social media, which allow a flood of brutal personal assaults, and especially brutal personal assaults about Barack Obama. Birtherism was not the least of them. When the dean referred to the notion that you're entitled to your own perspective but not your own facts, in the world we live in, anybody can have their own facts because you can find the outlet that's going to agree with them. And if you disagree, you're going to be labeled very likely in a vituperative personal way. But you look at all the attacks on Obama, and then you look at the 2016 campaign. It was a campaign of fear, smears, ad hominem attacks, low energy Jeb, lying Ted, little Marco, crooked Hillary, lock her up, a flood tide of Twitter crudeness. And I'm not going to try to establish a false equivalence here, but I also have to point out that the Clinton campaign was largely a personal attack on Trump. Some of it, in my view, justified, but that was almost the whole of it. Trump's character became a bright, shiny object that distracted from any real debate about issues. Only 9% of Clinton's ads dealt with the economy and jobs. That's almost unheard of for a Democrat. It failed as politics, too. So we live in a time, whether we like it or not, of polarization, retaliation, loss of civility on an unprecedented scale. I could pick this up and just read a random selection of tweets, and we would understand the kind of time we live in. A vast coarsening of the public dialogue. And I would reinforce one thing Dean Miller said. How can the university respond? Well, first of all, we can model civil dialogue. We can listen to the other side. The issue is not about who says it or how to attack them because they've said it, but to analyze what they've said, to recognize that at times they might even be right. Debate and discuss on the basis of facts, not false news or alternative facts. Think about evidence. Don't just take sides. Take ideas apart and put them back together. And when you believe something is wrong, stand your ground, argue it, do it with firmness and civility, even in the face of rampant incivility. I think of the model for this outside the academy, and that's Dr. Martin Luther King, who practiced civil discourse even in the midst of the most incendiary provocations. The university can and should model what civil discourse can be like, and in the process, if the academy and the public square can interact more together, I think can begin to help reshape the public square and can begin to set new standards. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I don't think it's easy. I think we're going to go through some rough years and some hard passages, but I think we can get there.
It seems to me that two issues have been really gotten a lot of debate, discussion relating to university campuses. And I'll start with the first, which is immigration. And so I'm just curious how you guys might want to think through how we talk about issues which have, a lot of very specific relevance for a lot of our university community.
Our biggest focus from the administrative standpoint is to look out for the Trojan family. We are a family. We look out for each other. If anyone is feeling personally concerned about this or upset by this, there are resources available. The central administration put out a letter giving some of those resources. If anyone feels that they didn't get that or don't have it, I actually brought some copies if someone would like one. But really, the university's perspective is to make sure that we're looking out for our students and our faculty.
Well, I think there's the economic collapse of 2008, I think left a lot of people feeling dispossessed, and in the European Union, where recovery was not what it was here, even if you think it was somewhat anemic here, it was certainly anemic there, and there are a lot of people who feel dispossessed, and at the same time it is easy to blame immigrants or trade or something like that for the problems that people have. And I would go back to something I said in my earlier remarks. The internet and social media are not an American phenomenon. They're a global phenomenon. And they drive all of this. I mean, there are plenty of alternative facts running around Europe right now, as you have the run-up to the French election, the run-up to the German election. So I think there's economic dissatisfaction. There's a sense of cultural displacement, which, by the way, is, I think, very much a factor here. A lot of America's becoming a majority non-white country. California is already a majority non-white state. And I think a lot of people are alienated or angry or traumatized by this. And the pace of other cultural changes in terms of gay rights, for example, I think really discombobulates some people. Marine Le Pen just promised that if she got elected president of France, she was going to repeal the law for marriage equality. So I don't think we're alone in this, but I think we do play a leadership role. And if we can create a more civil dialogue, which I said earlier is going to take real time and real effort here, it will have an impact in other places. I think the cultural change I was talking about is exactly what you're now pointing to. There are people who are not comfortable with women speaking out or having a kind of leading role. I think we will find some research over the next year or two. There are already indications of it that show that Hillary Clinton was disadvantaged by being a woman. That instead of getting all these women to vote for her, which they didn't, Republican women in the suburbs ultimately went back to Trump, that she was disadvantaged by it. But I think the same thing is true with African Americans, with Hispanics, with gay people and lesbians and transgender people. These were folks who were left out of the conversation in America for a very long time. And if you think about it, the civil rights movement, when Kennedy, I'm not sure Kennedy knew what he was letting loose when he said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And people started saying, well, we can do a lot. And you had the civil rights movement, which I think helped spark the feminist movement, which helped spark the gay rights movement, which helped spark the farm workers and Cesar Chavez. And so the country began changing around us. And I agree with you. I think people were traumatized by it. But the university, again, has to model respect for women, for other voices, for minorities. And if we don't do that on this campus, then we sure know it's not going to happen in the wider world.
Yeah, I was about to say something very similar. I mean, I'm looking at this room. There's a lot of diversity right here in this room, and that's amazing. It's great. And I think us in this group and groups like this at this university, figuring out how to talk to each other and how to show other people that we can talk to each other that way is a big step forward.
Well, let me say first that when you lose, you don't get any love. There was a Time magazine story in 1960 that described the Kennedy campaign as coruscatingly brilliant. And he walked into a staff meeting and said, change 60,000 votes and we're coruscatingly stupid. That said, it was the first Democratic campaign in my memory that ran without a serious economic argument on television. She actually had a big economic program, but it wasn't really talked about. They ran no ads in Wisconsin, for example. And I think two things happened. One, the Access Hollywood tape in the end may have hurt them, because I think they got so distracted by it that became, the personal attacks on Trump became the bright, shiny object. And I had always thought, as some of my students know, that it would move on from that to talking about Trump's business record and what Trump's economic policy would really do versus what her economic policy would really do. But they got distracted by it, and they thought that it was a winning argument. I think it was a pretty winning argument on the coast. It wasn't so much a winning argument in some of the blue states, where the blue wall states that crumbled and where people were economically insecure. The second thing was, the new data analytics have become the new secret sauce of campaigns, or the new silver bullet. And the Clinton campaign had the largest data analytics operation ever, much bigger than what Obama had in 2012 or 2008. The capacities were greater too. And the problem is, it depends what data you put in. There's an old phrase, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. If you put the wrong data in, you're not necessarily going to get the right answers. So for example, I had a friend who's a very long time, goes all the way back to the Carter White House, longtime Democratic operative, who went to Michigan and called people in Brooklyn and said, look, you're in trouble in Michigan. And you need to get on the air. You need to get on the air with economic ads. You need to talk to the insecurities of these people. And he was told that they had run hundreds of thousands of simulations, and in 98-point-something% of them, she won Michigan, so stop worrying, you don't know what you're talking about. And I think it was an arrogance of data that infected this. And Bill Clinton, by the way, was arguing that you had to go out there and really make an economic case, that it was still the economy stupid. So I think that's what happened. Now look, change 38,000 votes, and 3 states, and she's the President of the United States, and we're talking about how she overcame Comey and the Russians and all that other stuff. So I offer these criticisms because I believe them, but I also want to emphasize, having been in the position, that if you lose an election by this much, or if you lose it by 5-4 in the Supreme Court, as we did with Gore in 2000, you know, it's easy to say, well, what else could you have done right? One, I think it will continue. I don't think this is a one-off. 2, the AP, and I think somebody else boycotted the gaggle, which was not held in the briefing room, but in Sean Spicer's office. Time Magazine. They just boycotted. I think the answer has to be for the press to stand up, leave Breitbart News aside or Drudge, but for the press to stand up as a whole, including Fox News. And by the way, the press stood up for Fox News in the Obama administration when Fox News was kind of being dissed by the Obama press operation, a little more subtly than this, but the press stood up for Fox News. So I think the press has to stand up for itself. And again, you can do it in a very straightforward, fact-based, respectful way. And that's what I suspect we'll see on the news tonight when this is all reported. Do I think this is dangerous? Yeah, I think it's dangerous. I think an attack on the press is an attack on democracy. And to go back to Jefferson, what was the line he said? If he had to choose to have a country without free newspapers or a country without a government, he'd choose a country without a government.
I think we need to really hold our ground. We need to stay a place that you can marinate on things. We need to maintain our identity as a place where we think about hard problems in an analytical way, and we take the time to conduct basic research, to do basic scholarship. We have to hold our ground on that. That is important. We have to be a place where students can take their time in a safe environment to learn how to think in the way that ultimately has to be the right answer. It has to be the right answer that you learn to sift through facts and you learn to understand how to distinguish facts from opinions. And the place of the university, in my view, has never been more important. If we get caught up in this rush to try to do things in a way that is not what we're about, then the society as a whole doesn't even have us. We need to play that role. And I think we need to be very clear that that's the role that we're going to continue to play.